Okay, Daf Ayin Daled. We're picking this up in the Sugi of Ne'emonos here on Ayin Gimel Mid Beis, around 12 lines from the bottom. Tana Rabbanan, Ne'emenes Chaya, Leimer Zekain, Zelevi. A Chaya, which means a midwife, can say, this kid is a Kain, this kid's a Levi, Zen Nosin, Zen Mamzer, but Bamedvar Mamurim, that's Shalei Kara, but Bamedvar Mamurim, that's only Shalei Kara Aleha Shem Ir. As long as there's no Ir on this kid anymore, Avokara Aleha Ir, but once already there's, a rumor about this kid, if there's a challenge, then Eina Ne'emenes, then the Chaya won't be Ne'emenes, because at that point she's going Keneged a Chazaka that's being established based on that error. So for the Gemara, okay, help us understand the error. Error demai, ilim error chad. If it's one aid that said this, there is no error less than two. So ela error trey. Or and I'll tell you, really really it is only one person's error. And v'chi amar Rabbi Yochanan ein error pachas mishnayim. That's hani mili hecha deisa chazaka de kashrus. Only if there was already a chezkas kashrus before the error happened, and therefore the error is coming to slug up the chezkas kashrus. Aval hecha de leka chazaka de kashrus, like with a baby that has no history, then chad nami mehemen. Then there can even be an error de chad, even according to Rabbi Yochanan. The next set of Ne'emonos, Ne'eman bal mekach leimer zeh macharti v'lozeh ein macharti. So this is the guy who's selling the schayra over here. He could say, I sold to this guy, but I didn't sell to this guy. I guess they're both fighting that he sold it to them. But bamed dvarim murim, how do we qualify that Ne'emonos? Bisman shemekchay biyadai, as long as the merchandise is still in the meicher's hands. Aval ein mekchay biyadai, ein Ne'eman, if the stuff is no longer in his hands, he's not Ne'eman. Why? As Rashi explains, because he'll be less careful. Kolzman, it's in his hands. There's the potential for the Mishapara, because he wants to make sure to give it to the right person, and therefore he'll be very careful. But that Ne'emonos falls off once he gives it away. Taisus is a different shot, but that's how Rashi learns. Nechzi zuzi miman noket. Why don't we just see from who he got the money? Because we're assuming if he only got the money from one of the two, we would certainly assume that he would remember who he got the money from, to which the Gemara says, leitzricha de noket mitervayu. The Meicher took money from both of them. For Omar, and he said, chad midaite, chad balkarchi. One, I got the money because of the sale, and one was balkarcha. V'lo hai midaite, v'hai le midaite. It's not known to us which one was the balkarcha and which one was the midaita. Next, a judge, a dayan, is believed to say that this is the guy who won the din Torah and this is the guy who lost. But bamed var mamurim, that's shebali dinim oimdin lefanov. Aval ein bali dinim oimdim lefanov ein ne'eman. It depends whether the litigants are still standing in front of the judge. But once they leave, you can't be mechayev this dayan to remember who won and who didn't win. Let's see who has the documentation that says that the guy won the din Torah. And for the Gemara, leitzricha dekriya is chusayhu. Doesn't exist. It was torn up. You don't have that nusach anymore. So for the Gemara, v'nehader v'nidaininhu. And why don't we just rejudge the case? I mean, the evidence didn't change, the people didn't change. L'chayr, the same psak would come out, which the Gemara says, b'shuda de daini. We're talking about the kind of case that you can't have a good psak, and only was a shuda de daini. Shuda daini sounds like it could be an arbitrary decision. Rashi seems to learn that it's the best hashara of the dayanim, whereas Tosfos argues with Rashi and says, no, really, there really is no right answer, and it really is just completely an arbitrary choice that the dayan gets to make, but not based on the analyzation of any evidence. Of Nachman, Shleisha Ne'emanim al Bechar. There are three who are Ne'eman Legabe a Bechar to establish who is the Bechar in a family. Ve'eluhein Chaya, Aviv, ve'imai. So Chaya la'alter, like we already said. Imai kol Shiva, the first 7 days of the baby. And Aviv li'olam. Kedetanya, this memra that the father can be Ne'eman la'olam is because it says in Pasuk Yakir, meaning Yakirenu la'acherim. The father recognizes the Bechar and it means he can identify him for everybody else. Mikanam Rabbi Yehuda, Ne'eman Adam Leimer Zebni Bechar, Ukashem Shene'eman Leimer Zebni Bechar, Kach Ne'eman Leimer Zeben Grusha ben Chalutza. So Rabbi Yehuda, based on this, says that a father has this kind of superpower of Ne'emanis Lagabe his kids to say they're kosher or even puzzle. So the Chachamim are only arguing about the Kayin saying whether his kid is a puzzle, but they do agree that the idea of Yakir says that he could say who is the Bechar in the family. And the Mishnah said, Abashal haya kair l'shtuki beduki. So he had a different name for shtukis. He called them bedukis. My beduki. What's the point of calling them bedukis? If you're telling me that it means that we're going to ask the mother, who is the father of this baby? Was he a kosher? And the mother would be believed. So come on, who would Abishal will be saying this, like Rabban Gamliel? So Tanin Chadazimna, this would be nothing original because we already know this from Ksuvas. Titanan Haisimu Beres Amru Lama Tiva Shel Uberzef. Somebody says, hey, what's the story with this kid? Amru Lahem, and the woman says, Me Ish Pleni V'Kayanhu. So Rabban Gamliel Rabbi Eliezer Imrim Ne'emenes, because of the Bari V'Shem Sugya over over there, Bari Adif in Ksuvis. Rabbi Yeshua, Amar Levi Pianu Chayan, she's not Namenis. Rabbi Yehuda Mershmuel Halacha Kram Gamliel. But the point is, there's nothing new here. So why would Abba Shaul be calling him Shtuki Beduki, assuming that there's Namanis? We already know that from Rabbi Gamliel. To which the Gemara says, no, Abba Shaul is saying something even more than Rabbi Gamliel. Because Chada Lahachshir Ba, according to Rabbi Gamliel, we're saying that she can marry a Kayan. Chada Lahachshir Babita. But according to Abba Shaul, we're even extending Kula to the daughter of this woman to say that she can marry a Kayan. So for the Gemara, Hani Chalamanda Omer L'Divrei Machshir Ba Paisel Babita, that only if you are Machshir, the mother, that doesn't take care of the daughter also. But Elamanda Omer L'Divrei Machshir Ba Machshir Babita, and it's one din of Vaday Namanas on both. So Abba Shaul Mayos Lashmina, and then what would Abba Shaul be coming to tell us? To Emfret the Gemara, Abba Shaul Adifa Mid Rabban Gamliel. Why? Dime Hasam, if we're only going to learn from over there in Ksubas alone, Havi Amina Hasam Derev Ksherim Metzla. Most of the men klape this woman are going to be Ksherim. Aval Hecha Derev Psul Metzla. Let's say most men are going to be puzzled to her. Let's say Lamashal, she's Narusa, so most everybody's usher to her. Or she's in a place where most people are usher to the Kohanim. So Emalei, then maybe I would think she's not Namenis. Tzricha Zokt Abba Shaul. It's even more than Rabban Gamliel, and therefore she's a Beduki. She is going to have Namanas to say about the kid. Amarava Halacha Ke'Abba Shaul. Zokt the Mishnah. Kol ha'asurin lovek v'kahal. Anybody who's usher to marry the kahal of Klal Yisrael, mutar and lovek zebazeh, they can marry each other. Rabbi Yehuda Iser. Now this memra is a little bit unclear, and we're going to go through in the Gemara several pshatim, 5 I believe, to say what is the pshat in kol ha'asurin lovek v'kahal and what is Rabbi Yehuda arguing. Continues the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Aimer. Vadayin bivadayin mutter. If you're vaday usher to marry lekahal, then you could also marry somebody who's vaday usher loved lekahal. Vaday besfeiken or sveiken bivadayin or sveiken besveiken. All those are going to be usher because you might end up having someone who's vaday kosher marrying someone who's vaday puzzle. But since we don't know, they're all going to be usher. Ve'elu hen asveikais, shtuki, asufi, vekusi. And we'll see in the Gemara why akusi is also suffik. Zok the Gemara, my kola asur love bekahal. What are we talking about? Ilema mamzeri nasini shtuki v'asufi sahan tanalai reisha. That's what we learned in the Mishnah, that mamzeri nasini shtuki v'asufi mutar lavai zebazeh. And also more of a su, Rabbi Yehuda Iser. If you tell me Rabbi Yehuda is answering that, ahai. Ilema vadayin besveikin. If you're telling me that Rabbi Yehuda is answering when a vadai, let's say mamzer, is going to marry a suffik mamzer. So Hamadik Tani Sefer from the end of the mission that Rabbi Eliezer Amar Vadayin bevadayin mutter, Vadayin besveikan, usveikan besveikan usher. That means Mechlal Rabbi Yehuda lo svirle. That's not going to work either. So it doesn't make sense to say Rabbi Yehuda is arguing if all the Reisha in the Mishnah is doing is repeating what we had in the earlier Mishnah. Okay, so let's have another pshat. V'chitema Rabbi Yehuda oiser ager b'mamzeres. Maybe you'll say this member of Rabbi Yehuda is specifically talking about a ger to a mamzeres. But that doesn't work in the Mishnah because midi ger b'mamzeres ketani. That's not the nusach of the Mishnah. Kol ho asur and love b'kal ketani. All right, so we're going to say another pshat. Omer Rav Yehuda, the Amira, turning over. Hachi ka'amar. This is what the Mishnah means to say. Kol ho asurim love b'kal kahuna. Dafka, those who are usher to be married into the kahal kahuna. My ninhu, who are they? That's a giyaris pchusim mibas shalosh shanam v'yayim echad. That's a girl who became a giyaris before she hit 3 years in one day, meaning before she was shaykh to bia and before she had the potential of having a din zayna. Udaloika Rishim ben Yochai, because according to Rishim ben Yochai, it's only because of that category of zayna that she'll be asura. Therefore, those girls, mutar and lavai zabozeh, those gerim and mamzerim and asinim can all marry with one another. But the Mishnah's opening lines talking about that ger can't marry a kayan. She could marry the mamzer and the nasin. That's what Rabbi Yehuda is coming to argue with. So why don't we say the Mishnah is talking about a Giyaris who was more than 3, and the Mishnah can even go like Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. That's why they're all in the same category. To which the Gemara says, Im Kain mitzida tavra. Now you can't learn the Mishnah that way because it'll become upshlugged from the very next line. Because it's only because she's that age. But it sounds like if she's less than 3 years old, demuteris lavai bekal kahuna, but it'll be aser lavai zebazeh. If it's muteris to marry a kain, it's going to be usher to one to the other. So it won't work to go ahead and say that the Mishnah is talking about a girl who's older than 3, because then you won't be able to understand the next line of the Mishnah. So it's clear that we're not talking about the age of 3 years old or not. So now we need another pshat. Uklolahu, and it's taka ruled. That as long as you're usher to marry a kain, you could marry one another. V'hare almana, v'grusha, v'chalola, v'zayna. Let's say you have these kinds of women. These almanas and grushais can't marry kaihanim, but they still can't marry mamzerim and nasinim. It's interesting that almana is part of the list. Rav Pinchas Gross pointed out that an almana is only usher to a kohen gadol. So it's hard to call that usher loved b'kahal kahuna. And continues the Gemara, another kasha, v'su, ha-mutter usher, if you're mutter to marry a kohen, you can't marry a mamzer, v'hare gersh mutter b'kohenes, and umutter b'mamzeres. So you see the rule doesn't even hold water. So we're going to give up on Rav Yehuda's pshat in the Mishnah, and we'll say a different pshat in the Mishnah. Ela Omer Rav Nasan bar Ahishya hachi kamer, kol, Shekayan Asr Lisa is bitay. Any person whose daughter can't marry a Kayan, umay nihu, who's that? That's a Gersha Nosaki Yaires, who could Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, because according to Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, that we're going to see in the Mishnah coming up on Ayin Zayin, that the daughter of Gerim is Asr to marry a Kayan only if both parents are Gerim. And over there, Rabbi Yehuda argues. So Kol Shekayan Asr Lisa is bitay, umay nihu, Gersha Nosaki Yaires. If one Gerim marries a Giyaires, ukid Rav Elazar ben Yaakov, mutarin lavay zebazeh, then those Gerim Mamzerim Nesinim can marry one another. Will that be the rule? The chol shekayin asur lisa as bitay mutarin lavay zebazeh. Hare chol shenasa bas Yisrael. What about a chol that marries a bas Yisrael? The kayin asur lisa bitay, because his daughter can't marry a kayin. Va'asur nami lavay zebazeh. But yet the rule is that they, meaning these chalolim and mamzerim, can't marry one another. For the Gemara lekasha kirav distayver of Yehuda, as you remember the mikvah tara for the chalolim, so therefore it would be mutter. Okay, but there's still other problems with Rav Nasan bar Arishiya's pshat, because hare chol shenasa chalala the kayin asur lisa bitay. You have a case of a chol married a chalala whose daughter a kayin can't marry. Asur nami lavay zebozeh, and that chol also can't marry with those whose daughters would be asur to a kayin, like mamzerim and nesinim. V'su ha mutter asur. This idea that if you're mutter to marry a kayin, you can't marry the mamzer. V'hare gershon asur bas Yisrael the kayin mutter lisa bitay mutarin lavay zebozeh. So even though the kayin could marry her daughter according to this pshat in the Mishnah, but still these gerim are allowed to marry with these mamzer. So now we come to another pshat. Elo Omer Rav Nachman Omer Rabba bar Avua hacha mamzer me'achayso mamzer me'eshes ishi kibinav. There are different flavors of mamzerim. The machlekes between Tanakam and Rabbi Yehuda is talking about what kind of mamzers come from an achaysai, a familial isser, and one that comes from an eshes ish. Tanakama savar afilu mamzer me'achayso nami have a mamzer, because that one only has a chi of karis and not a chi of misa. That's also called mamzer. But Rav Yehuda savar me'eshes ish have a mamzer, me'achayso have a mamzer. The only kind of isser that makes a mamzer is one from an eshes ish, but not from the other kind of arayas. Frak the Gemara, what would be the chiddush? My komashmalan tanina. We already know this from another Mishnah in Masechti Yavamis. Ezehu mamzer kol shehu b'lo yavai divrei Rabbi Akiva. Right, because Rabbi Akiva has the very expansive definition of any lav, also make mamzerim. Shimon atimni aimer kol shechayavin olav karis b'dei shamayim v'halacha kedvarav. As long as there is karis, there's going to be a mamzer kite. Rabbi Yeshua aimer, the third shita, is kol shechayavin olav misas bezdin. So since this is a beferish machlekes in Masechti Yavamis, why would Rabbi have to say it again here? Elo amar Rava ger amayni moyavi ikabinayu. You have these kinds of lavim. What kind of ger? A ger that you weren't allowed to become a ger. A ger amayni moyavi. Those to each other mutar and lavai zebazeh. So Yachi Mai Rabbi Yehuda Iser. Then what would Rabbi Yehuda aser l'mchaira? Why can't, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the Amayni and the Moyavi marry a mamzer? Hachi kamer. This is what the Mishnah means to say. And the way Rashi learns is that there really is no machlekes at all between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakhama. They're all just explaining. Afal pish Rabbi Yehuda Iser ger b'mamzeres. Even though according to Rabbi Yehuda, a ger can't marry a mamzeres. Hani mili ger deroy lava b'kahal. But if you're a bad kind of ger, al ger Amayni Moyavi de'en ru'uin lava b'kahal, then loi. We're going to stop here. Pick it up in Mirza Hashem tomorrow.